Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone. Hello, and welcome to our webinar, to the Tool Design Group webinar on rebalancing streets for people. We appreciate you taking the time to join us today. We had over 1,000 people register for this webinar, so clearly this is a topic that people are thinking about right now. So we also have some folks joining us from Facebook Live, and we'll go ahead and get started. Okay, my name is Jennifer Toole, and I'm the president of Tool Design, and I'm joined by two colleagues who are going to share a number of practical implementation strategies to create more safe places to walk, bike, and run. Of course, today we mean by the word safe, we mean both in the traditional road safety sense, but also safe in relation to our need to be physically distant from each other to prevent the spread of COVID-19 per the guidance of the CDC, as well as state and local health agencies. Our agenda for the next hour includes a brief introduction from me before Jeremy and Gwen focus on the details. And we'll close by addressing your questions. Now, first, I know we are all rapidly becoming experts at Zoom and other platforms, but I do have a couple of reminders. You are all muted automatically. We've asked for questions ahead of time, and we'll address those as best we can when we're done. And if a critical question comes up during the presentation, use the Q&A function during the presentation, and we will address that question if we can. And if we aren't able to do so, we'll follow up by email afterwards. There's also a chat function that you're welcome to use, but that's not the place to ask questions of the presenters. Okay, I have three things I want to say by way of introduction. First, I think it's important to acknowledge just how dramatically and quickly this pandemic has exposed systemic inequities in so many aspects of daily life, from healthcare and employment to housing, access to food, and of course, transportation. And I think it's important to take a moment to reflect on the fact that these inequities have been there all along and were a daily reality for millions of Americans before COVID-19. And the solutions that we come up with need to be applied with equity, ethics, and empathy now more than ever. Second, at the same time, we're witnessing an extraordinary social experiment in real time. Across the globe, air quality is improving almost overnight as automobile traffic disappears from city streets. And we're learning which trips are essential and how much work we can do remotely. And in a twist, cleaner air helps some of the people who are most at risk if they become ill with COVID-19, people with asthma. I feel like this is sort of the silver lining on a dark cloud, but something we can celebrate and learn from. Third, I want to address an issue right up front here. Several of our clients and colleagues have reached out to us to ask if we are suggesting strategies that go against orders that require people to stay at home. Strategies that might result in more people outdoors and in close proximity to each other. And there have been concerns about people flocking to parks and trails and creating conditions where the virus can spread. In fact, I don't think that all health departments are necessarily in agreement about this, but clearly there are some outdoor activities that can be safe if we can do them in a way that's physically separated from others. So no, we're not suggesting that people congregate in the same place at the same time. Rather, we want to create conditions where there are many more safe places for people to walk, bike, and run. using safe distancing strategies. We need more space, not less space for these activities. And we also need to acknowledge that there's a critical window of time in the next couple of weeks where we need to be limiting interaction to the bare minimum. And we certainly need to be careful about doing things that could attract a lot of people to one location. I think there's a few factors at play here that I want to talk about. We need to remember that physical activity and time outside of the house is absolutely essential for humans to maintain their physical and emotional health. There are volumes of scientific research that tells us that being outside and experiencing nature, even if it's just a street treat, brings a wide variety of physical and mental benefits to humans. In fact, boosting our immune system. Even as little as 30 minutes of exercise a day, a simple walk, boosts our immune systems and makes us healthier. So we need to find ways to enable people to safely go outside. And while people may be convinced to stay inside for a week or two, they can't and they won't stay indoors for months on end, nor can we ignore the detrimental effects that that would have on their mental and physical health. I know that sometimes in a crisis like this, it's hard to see beyond a week or two, but people are desperate to get out of their homes and will be even more so in a few weeks from now. So we need to plan ahead. In fact, I would argue that it's safer for us to plan ahead and meet that demand rather than pretend it won't exist. Looking even further into the future after the stay-at-home orders are lifted, there's likely to be an extended period of time when this disease is still going to be with us. But we are going to be gradually reopening society, and we'll still have a need to maintain physical separation. People won't be able to ride on crowded buses and subways, and will have a need to get from place to place by walking and biking. I think it's important to acknowledge that city and state leaders are making decisions without much of a playbook to rely on here. Decisions on whether packed trails and parks are simply closed or more spaces added alongside them are equally understandable and have led to very different outcomes in cities such as Minneapolis, Chicago, and Los Angeles. I'm pretty sure we all want more safe places to be active, so I think the challenge is to figure out how to make that happen. I also want to acknowledge that this is a very busy time for public works departments. Many of them are in crisis mode and are being drafted into roles that they have not had to play before. And diverting resources to close roads for more space for walking and biking may not be on the top of their list of priorities this week or next week. I don't know who Honky Rules Pools is, but the sentiment he expresses is certainly worth considering. But thinking ahead a little again to a time when we've had extended periods of time in isolation and when businesses and workplaces are being gradually reopened, having enough space on our streets and sidewalks is going to be important. We have an opportunity now to experiment with some things to prepare for that time. Finally, when this is all over, there will be more people working from home than ever before, like your three presenters today. These are our home work environments. We will have figured out that it's possible to work from home and still stay connected to our colleagues. I might have to invest in an actual desk instead of a card table, but there are a lot of people predicting that things won't go back totally to the way they were before the pandemic. And people who work from home are going to need to be able to access trails and safe streets and parks for their mental and physical health. Which brings us to the topic of the day, rebalancing streets for people. I'm going to turn this over to my colleagues, Jeremy and Gwen. But before they start, I just wanted to say that we aren't here to advocate one course of action over another. We're here to share with you a series of practical steps and things to consider as you begin planning for how to enable folks to be outside and practice safe distancing in your community. All right, with that, I'll turn it over to Jeremy.
All right, thanks, Jennifer. Yeah, so as we look through sort of what we're seeing across the country and solutions that are being identified, we're seeing that as the general trend points and sort of obvious that traffic volumes are going down, but and pretty significantly. If you look at the INRIX data from just last week, they're showing nationwide volumes are down at least 40% across the country. But we're also recognizing that every road looks like every car commercial that we've ever seen in our lives, that the roads are wide open and that's accommodating faster speeds, which is also a troubling trend, given that we have more people out on the roads, both walking and biking, whether that's to get to their essential jobs or just to get out and get groceries or get some fresh air. So if you look at a place like New York, they've seen quite an uptick in the bicycle crashes, and that somewhat points to some lack of connectivity of their overall bike networks. Next slide, please. And it sort of points to a problem that we all knew sort of existed, that some of our infrastructure wasn't really adequate enough to accommodate people walking and biking to begin with. But then when you couple that with a need for social distancing, it sort of points to this notion that the sidewalks weren't wide enough, forcing people out into the streets. And this is a growing trend that we're seeing every neighborhood, that the streets are sort of naturally being taken over by people without any real definition of the use of the space or protection of those users. Next slide. Yep. So an obvious solution is to change some of those lane configurations to actually accommodate these users. And the lowest hanging fruit of all of these, and these are prevalent across the country, are sort of standard 4-lane roads that they can relatively easily be closed or changed to two-way or 2-lane operation. And you know, the challenge with a lot of typical road diets that we see is that we're often trying to go 4 lanes to 3 lanes, and that often means some changes in the signal operations and changes in the locations of the signal heads over the lanes, and that's a whole lot of extra work that we don't have time to implement in this crisis. So looking for opportunities where we don't have to make those physical changes and can essentially just cone off the outside lanes and provide that space as overflow from the sidewalks or dedicated bike space, so that we're addressing those connections. And we also have these opportunities to repurpose some parking lanes in locations where retail is no longer functioning. I'm not suggesting that we close parking where we need it for drop-off and pickup areas or commerce purposes, but there are some locations where that parking could be repurposed. And I think the first step of all of this is to really understand what resources we have at our disposal. So what cones and barrels or potentially flex posts do you have in your existing stockpiles? What existing on-call contracts do you have with contractors? And what's already in their supply? I think these are the first calls that need to be made to understand what materials you have to work with, so that we can understand how much can actually be implemented with these changes in the streets. And the other potential benefit of changing these lane configurations is that we can narrow up the travel lanes and help to control the vehicle speeds, not only along the lengths of the corridors, but being deliberate to ensure that turning vehicles are doing so at a safer speed where we know we have more people crossing the streets. Next slide. And there's some other considerations that we need to look at, and this is sort of more context sensitive, but we have to look at how are the existing street networks operating, and are there existing land uses along a road that are causing queues to form, people queuing outside of grocery stores or other stores that are forcing people out into the street because there's simply not enough space on the sidewalk. And that's sort of a natural opportunity to carve out these additional spaces. We can also look to places that are already sort of doing this. This is the places where you have farmers markets or other regular events where public agencies are already frequently closing lanes and or closing streets entirely to vehicular traffic. We already have those plans at our disposal. Many communities have also done pop-up events, and therefore we have traffic control plans and ways of setting up these roads that don't require a lot of physical implementation. So we can pull these plans off the shelf and relatively easily implement them to provide these benefits. We also have to recognize that not all roads are going to be 4-lane roads, and that frankly, some roads just don't have the volumes that would warrant a need to make significant changes to those streets. So on a lower volume street, it would be fairly easy to just close that street off, indicate that it's for local traffic, and allow that space to be a little more comfortable for people that are already currently using it for walking and biking. Now, I should point out that this doesn't require a whole lot of infrastructure. The image on the screen now would show type 3 barricades, but this is something that can be easily done with a couple cones, making sure that we're not closing off access for deliveries and for people that are already living on those streets to still access their properties. But these are also things that could be done with a relatively simple online permitting process where you print out the permit, put it in a Ziploc bag, stick it on the back of a couple chairs, and use that to signify that you've gotten permission to close off your street. So it would take some burden off of public works officials who are already dealing with a lot of other things while still going through a formal process. We do want to make sure that roads are not just being closed by residents without any sort of thought to an overall network or overall connectivity. We also want to make sure that we're focusing on local access because we do have a lot of deliveries to these streets. So we need to be focusing on that as well. And I sort of mentioned this before, but recognizing that we have to know where our streets don't have enough sidewalk width and look for those opportunities to carve out the street space for people walking. We've also seen pretty much across the country that our shared use paths, which were in a lot of places already too narrow, are really feeling the burden of these types of changes, that you can't really accommodate social distancing with the volumes of users that are using these facilities. So looking for opportunities for parallel routes to these shared use paths so that when people are naturally going to these locations, they already see that there's another opportunity to use a parallel facility and not have to come in close contact with other people. We can also look for opportunities to separate bicyclists and pedestrians. So this was already an existing problem on a lot of our shared use paths, but now with these increased volumes and a need to be more separated, it makes the need for separation even more important. And sort of another low-hanging fruit is we don't need people to be touching push buttons. And I see that a lot of communities have already latched onto this idea, gone into their signal cabinets and put the signals on pedestrian recall. Yes, it means there's some additional delay associated with the pedestrian crossings, but given that we don't have the volumes of vehicular traffic on these streets anymore, and we don't want people congregating on corners, making this change makes a lot of sense. Next slide. And as I said, we don't want people congregating on intersection corners because it becomes more difficult to keep our separation. So sort of keeping cycle length short, a lot of our cycles already have nighttime signal timing that is set for shorter cycle lengths. We can flip that switch and sort of use that throughout the day so that we don't have people grouping up on intersection corners and then similarly needing more time to cross because they have to leave those natural gaps between people. I guess I would discourage people from using signals in flash mode, particularly when you have lots of pedestrian traffic. I guess the caveat to that would be if you're switching it to flashing mode and it's functioning as a stop controlled intersection, that may be an opportunity as well. And another thing we can look at is for routes that we're going to prioritize as pedestrian and bicycle routes, we could look to adjust the progression speeds along those corridors. It might throw some of the timing out of whack in terms of the overall grid, but if we're going to prioritize a particular route as a pedestrian and bicycle route, it's something worth considering for those types of corridors. And some other ideas, I think this is the first one at least, will need to be very context sensitive, but there may be some opportunities to move on-street parking to existing underused parking lots or garages, that these are currently unused spaces. And if that's an opportunity in your neighborhood that you could move cars and then be able to repurpose that space on the street for people walking and biking, that's another potential opportunity. And that we could also use, in addition to what I talked about before on closing lanes and ensuring at intersections that we're keeping speed slow, we can implement work zone type installations where we're lowering the speeds and clearly communicating what the expected operation is for motorists. This is really no different than what we're going to have to ask of bicyclists as well, that we need to be acting responsibly. We also need drivers to be driving responsibly so that we're not increasing the flow of people to hospitals. We need to really focus on speeds and reduce serious and fatal crashes at this time. So what are some of the planning considerations that we need to focus on? We've seen in some communities that park spaces are being closed because they're sort of natural gathering spaces. They're the places that people already want to go, and they just don't have the capacity to accommodate the number of people that are using it. By comparison, the routes that we're talking about, these carving out lanes and closing roads, they're not intended to be destinations. They're really just to provide people this location to be able to move along a street, get to their destinations, whether it's the grocery store or just to get a little exercise, and not really to gather. And there's ways that we can structure these configurations of road closures and lane closures so that we're giving people natural loops to get a little bit of exercise. And that's something that can be done as part of the messaging that, for example, doing one loop of this laid out route would be the equivalent of about 30 minutes worth of exercise. So having that clear messaging of what the purpose is of this facility and how people are supposed to be using it. But we also, as we're laying out this network, we should be thinking about ensuring that we're providing access to the essential services, whether that's people being able to walk from their house to the grocery store or ensuring that the people that work at these places are able to get there. And one other aspect of this is if we do this, this may free up the public space. So public parks may not be as overburdened. The adjacent trail networks may not be overburdened because we've carved out the space. And this is what we've seen places like Minneapolis doing. The city of Philadelphia similarly did it with some of their park frontage roads to be able to repurpose that space that was already being underutilized. As I said, we should be communicating what that purpose is. We're not looking for that time trial cyclist, the person that was training for a triathlon to get out there and be traveling quickly. It increases your risk of crashes, particularly with the increase of people out using these facilities. We're really just intending for this to be some light exercise so that people can get their heart rates going, get a little sunlight. I know those in Minneapolis have gone through a long winter and they're really itching to get out of their houses. And as Jennifer said, you can't keep people indoors for eternity. So sort of planning for that. In addition to this, we can also be looking for, as I talked about with shared use paths, we can think about carving out separate spaces for pedestrians and separating them from bicyclists because we have two different users of different volumes and different speeds. And when we allow them to mix at too high volumes, we're either going to create too close contact or this challenge of increased crash risks between those users. And we also have to recognize that there are natural inequities in our street networks. If you look at the split photo to the right here, the image on the left is a more financially secure neighborhood, and they tend to naturally have more trees. Whereas when we look at our lower income neighborhoods, they tend to have less access to backyards, they don't have tree-lined streets, and they don't really have all the same access that some of the higher income neighborhoods have. And that's why it's important to be thinking about providing accessible routes for these communities so that they have the same opportunities to get out and do some active transportation and breathe some fresh air. And I cannot overstress the importance of clearly communicating what the intended operations are for these facilities, whether that's through signage. So the city of Arlington made it clear that the trail systems were closed to group rides. That's going to be really important. Providing guidance on maintaining social distancing. And one of the questions we received prior to this presentation was people asking if we thought whether you should mark the entire length of these corridors to clearly communicate social distancing. And I think that may be a little too much, but we can provide visual cues at the beginning of these routes that illustrate what 6 feet looks like, so people can sort of commit that to memory and sort of naturally be guided by this. I think we should, as agencies, also need to be looking at getting feedback on how these facilities are working. And you can use social media to sort of monitor it, encourage people to use hashtags so that even if your agencies aren't able to get out and do actual observations, just from combing social media and seeing photos and sort of written guidance about what people are seeing and saying will help us to better understand how these are working and make adjustments as necessary. And we can also repurpose all the materials that the bike advocates and other groups have already prepared, tips on safe cycling, that this is the type of material that can be repurposed. We also should probably give more guidance to people that are biking to recognize that just maintaining 6 feet of separation while biking may not be appropriate. And you'll notice that the graph on the right specifically doesn't talk about very high speeds, because as I mentioned, we don't want to encourage that sort of behavior given the pressure on our hospital systems. And we have to recognize that this will eventually pass, but we don't know when and we don't know how this is all going to play out. It's very likely that this could be cyclical and we may have to do social distancing again. So understanding what works and making adjustments so that if and when we have to re-implement this, we already have a plan in place. We know how to put these facilities back into commission to address these issues. But we also need to understand that this return to normal is not likely to be as quick as the drop-off was, that people that are immunocompromised or older adults may decide to work from home for a longer period for fear of being exposed to the coronavirus. So we may have more people choosing to telecommute, but some people are also being more productive in this environment. Maybe not if you have children crawling all over you, but there are some people that are really recognizing that telecommuting is an option for them. So I think we need to sort of monitor how traffic is changing and how people's behaviors change and be prepared to address that for future conditions. And then finally, as we do move out of this, we need to be thinking about implementation strategies for the future and how over the summer could we potentially build out some bike networks that have a little bit more permanence, but are going through a formal process. One thing we want to stress with all of this is we're suggesting making changes to the streets as an emergency measure. We are not suggesting that this is a way of sort of cramming some infrastructure down people's throats without a formal public engagement process. This is a really important thing to stress when discussing these types of facilities with the public, that if we were going to implement this permanently, we would go through the normal process. But following rapid implementation, you're not building curb lines, you're not doing things that are going to cost a lot of capital and can be rolled out quickly to complete these networks. And I think that's what we need to have in the back of our minds to set us up for the future. With that, I'll turn it over to Gwen to talk about some public engagement.
Hello, everyone. So one of the questions that I'm going to be talking about is how do we ensure that the public has a voice in any of the decisions that are made now? Some key points are that the main thing is that you have to be transparent around the decisions that you're making. There should be rationale and kind of some explanation for why you're doing what you're doing. You should also solicit public input on where areas may be that require additional space. And as has been noted a bit throughout this presentation, is to apply the changes consistently throughout the communities. There are some inequities that are being very brought to light via this situation, and we need to make sure that through these efforts we are addressing those head on. One particular note is that it's important to make sure that we are continuing to focus on equitable outreach as more than ever. There are many people who aren't familiar with digital outreach or have access to participate, so those will be important. This is an example of a bike share map that is something that I think a lot of people on this line might be familiar with. You can set up a similar version for soliciting input from residents and businesses on where they may need additional space. As part of these efforts, use kind of the ideas that Jeremy has noted so far to develop a simple toolkit of strategies applicable to your agency. This will help set the messaging and expectations with the community of what options are feasible. Next slide. One example is that Seattle has been using parking data to identify areas that are seeing less demand than normal and can be converted into 3-minute parking for food pickup. They've also created this map that's shown on the screen, and also have a separate map that is called Support Seattle Small Biz that is identifying local restaurants that are open for delivery and takeout. So a lot of these are pulling on existing resources and mapping capabilities that the city had, and they're just repurposing that infrastructure to help facilitate this communication. Zoom, as we've all seen, Zoom and other tools have a lot of different features, and I think they're going to continue to come out with more features as we enter this time. As these changes get implemented, it's important to continue to involve key stakeholders in the process and decision making. With the focus of reaching typically underserved communities, engagement will be challenging, but that does not mean it shouldn't occur. Setting up community partners could be an additional way to alleviate city staff. Those community liaisons could go out and be reaching out to the community via virtually, not go out and reach out, but virtually reach out to communities and host virtual meetings. This meeting that I'm showing on the screen was for an ongoing project. The first 2 community group meetings were in person and were focused on bringing voices to the table that aren't often heard. With COVID, the project team decided it was important to keep communication lines open and to have a 3rd virtual meeting to keep the project moving. The team used a poll to understand what folks' priorities for discussion were, and then set up breakout groups based on the feedback. So if you go to the next slide, it shows that small breakout groups allowed more people to engage. A lot more people joined the video after when breaking out into the smaller groups, which was a lot better for ongoing communication. Specific questions were put up on the screen, as you can kind of see in these orange slides, and then blank pages were created using a virtual whiteboard for live note taking. Participants could also type in comments to the chat box, which could be saved as a text file at the end of the meeting or transferred live onto the whiteboard. A topic that we've seen come up time and time again has been touched on a bit so far is that some of these rebalancing efforts may be seen as beneficial beyond the current health crisis. Though this may be true, it's important to understand that this isn't necessarily the time to be pushing for those. One thing that can be done, though, is to use current or future plan projects as a starting point and utilize this crisis as an opportunity to broaden communities' minds about the possibility of using our streets differently. This is not the time to be advocating for bike and pedestrian projects in the traditional sense, but capacity pending, it may be a good time to show what's possible in the future. Existing resources and outreach efforts may be possible to use for current projects or adapted quickly and easily for use as resources to apply those projects and efforts distributed throughout the community. Over the past few weeks, I know I have, and I'm sure many of you have seen a few amazing examples of online engagement. This is an example from a charrette last week in Montana. On the website, there are several short videos going over different topics, so the public could focus just on the elements they are interested in. Daily updates were added each day of the week-long charrette, and this is just an example to show that these projects and the projects that we're implementing can be worked on with the community. Luckily, there are a lot of precedents to point to for examples of rapid implementation. The concept, in pre-COVID, it was known by many different names: rapid implementation, quick builds, demonstration projects, pilots, pop-ups, tactile urbanism. And though the context and the application is completely different for today's crisis, the principles from this implementation approach are very valuable. The resources will need to be adapted, but there's many to pull from. If you go to the next slide, shows some examples of sidewalk and curb extensions of various scales. There are similar examples for bikeways and traffic calming projects that could be referenced for ways to provide additional space. If you go to the next slide, these are just a few of many resources available. They have different scales. They provide ideas for project types that are beyond what's needed in reaction to COVID, but many of the community engagement and messaging principles documented here can be adapted. One specific example is permitting. Many of these quick build or demonstration projects are unlike things that agencies are used to permitting. So if your agency or ones you're working with have implemented, these types of projects, that permitting framework could be a really good template to start with. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Jennifer to wrap things up before we head into the Q&A session.
All right, thank you very much, Gwen. Okay, so how do we pull all of this together into a plan for a community? I think we need to simultaneously think big and think small, and make sure that people throughout our towns and cities have places where they can walk and bike, including and especially in lower income neighborhoods, because they're even, as Jeremy said, less likely to have yards and neighborhood parks within walking distance or streets with sidewalks and street trees. We need to think about the longer routes like the city of Winnipeg has. Starting next Monday, they're restricting vehicles on 4 streets during the day. This is one way to make sure that there's enough space so that people aren't crowded on just one route. And also that people have the ability to get to their jobs, particularly those folks that are needed in a time of crisis like this. We need to think about those park roads that could be closed to traffic. This is an example in San Francisco where they closed down Twin Peaks Boulevard and made it into a place where people can walk and bike with plenty of space to spread out. We can also think about some pre-existing routes. Pretty much every community has some ready-made courses and routes that are closed down for events and parades, or 10K runs or 5K runs. And traffic control, we may have examples where we already have traffic control plans in place for these yearly events that we can draw upon. But we also need to think about local streets that we can repurpose as walking and biking streets. We can plan these in areas where there are other easily accessible alternative routes for emergency access. We need to think about the time of day of restrictions and also consider the capacity of our local public works staff. Just like everyone else, their responsibilities are changing during this pandemic. We need to look at their workloads and make sure they have the capacity to implement these kinds of solutions and also make sure that they are safe while they're doing those things. There are a lot of resources that are available and growing by the day. In addition to social media, sites like Streets Blog and Strong Towns are other resources to turn to see what communities are doing. NACDO just launched a resource guide, a place to catalog what transportation agencies are doing in response to COVID-19. Tabitha Combs at UNC is compiling a list of cities making ways for social distance for pedestrians and bikes. We'll send out a link after the webinar to all of these resources. Also want to mention that both APBP and the Vision Zero Network have just terrific information about how to reduce speeds and other low-cost implementation strategies to make streets safer. Our colleagues at Kittleson, Nelson Nygaard, and Alta have all published resources on their websites, and as have we on our website. We'll include links to all of that. And I also want to just encourage people to share what you're doing with NACDO via their website and on your own social media feeds. There's just some great work going on out there. Let people know what you're doing. And then finally, just don't want to forget that the standard reference guides still apply. There are a few things I did want to point out. The Tactical Urbanism Guide to Materials and Design that was created by Mike Leiden, Streets Plan Collaborative, is really a fantastic comprehensive collection of alternative materials for pop-up and rapid implementation projects. That's a really good source. And it catalogs those things by element, such as barriers, surface treatments, signs, etc. And it even provides some high-level cost estimates. And then also just hot off the press, Federal Highway Administration just published a free course on bikeway planning and selection that Tool Design helped create, which is great if you have some downtime while you're at home, while you're working from home. Finally, just let us know if you need help. If you would like a tailored version of this webinar for your community, or just some technical assistance with choosing pilot streets or deciding what design measures to use, please do reach out to us. You can contact me and I'll put you in touch with the right person at Tool Design. Also, follow us on Twitter. We're posting and retweeting the ideas that we see out there. All right, so now on to questions. Jeremy has been monitoring our Q&A section on the website, and maybe I'll let him start and bring up some questions that have come up during the presentation.
Sure. So one of the questions I got in advance was, are communities who are implementing this getting back when they try to force a bike-centric design in a time of crisis? And Gwen, I'm wondering if you could respond to that one.
Yes, definitely. It's a great question. I think we absolutely must avoid this. These are public health measures, pure and simple, not about catering to one group or another. And in fact, a case can be made that elderly folks have a particular need to be able to get out and walk to boost their immune systems. So that's just an example to show that this is not about bike and ped projects necessarily.
Gwen, we also received a few questions both in the question section and in the chat about addressing the digital divide, whether that's lack of quality internet or access to computers, as well as non-English speaking communities. I know that the image we showed from Minneapolis of some of the signage that was used was multilingual, and I've seen that in a number of other communities as well. And that without internet, we have seen, and we've used on past projects, the ability to at least text feedback on locations of routes or things like that, and be able to provide things by text. But given that we can't do face-to-face surveys and sort of that more hands-on engagement, do you have any other suggestions to help bridge that digital divide?
I don't fully know the answer to that. I think it's a great question, and I think it's something that is extremely important to focus on as we continue. In addition to kind of the physical and technical things that we've discussed today, that's something that we're not going to be able to get around. I know that it was also something that we as an industry have been facing and addressing pre this public health crisis, is how do we make sure that we're hearing all the possible voices. I think one of the examples that I've seen, in addition to kind of the texting options that you have noted, there's the SMS texting. There's a few different resources out there that can help facilitate that type of communication, so it doesn't require a smartphone. But I think also just relying on the existing community partnerships that you have, there may be an opportunity for, you know, close community partners to be able to do more specific and targeted outreach. Whether it's you know, it's going to be a huge challenge to not be able to do that in person, but they might be able to call folks up on the phone that you, as, you know, a public staff person, isn't able to do in the same way, and just try to chat and try to get some input. And so I think relying on those existing, you know, nonprofits that are probably also facing a huge number of unknowns, I think just being communicative and making sure that you're doing your absolute best to try to hear all the voices is going to be critical. It was a hard challenge before, and it's going to continue to be a hard and important challenge going forward.
Thanks, Gwen. I think I'm going to give this next one to Jennifer. How do you counter arguments that there are more pressing concerns than active mobility options in today's climate? What can we do to make the case in our communities to remind folks why and how these conversations and issues are still relevant?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. It really goes back to what I was talking about at the beginning of the presentation, that this is not necessarily as much about active mobility right now, but about giving people opportunities to be safe while they're outside. And, you know, the demand, you can go to any community in the country and see that the demand for this is just tremendous. Sidewalks that are filled with people and families who are needing to get out and get a breath of fresh air. The lockdown's not going to last forever, and people can and will go outside. And we're just going to have a need to address this issue in the weeks and months to come. It's not going to go away for a while. So it's really about keeping people safe.
Mm-hmm. Another question that we received is if we could give a sense of the permitting requirements to make these types of street changes. And I also heard questions about what about worker safety, installing cones and those sorts of things. And I think the two can really be tied together, that that permitting requirements can be sort of minimized, particularly if you can do some online permitting and have local residents print out the permit, print out the road closed sign, or, you know, put up appropriate numbers of barricades at the entrances to streets so that the UPS and FedEx and local traffic can still access it while still following a formal process, because I really do think that these networks really need to be thought through, and it shouldn't just be the Wild West. But I also recognize that public works folks are really struggling with how to implement some of these facilities when their workers are at risk, and many of them are working from home and struggling with the idea of sending somebody else out to put out cones. And I sort of saw this at some of our pop-up events, that there are naturally easy ways to set up some of these types of installations while maintaining social distancing. So the pop-up event I'm thinking of, we had a contractor that was putting out barrels, and it meant that there was one person driving a truck, one person hanging off the back of the truck dropping the cones, and I was following behind as the traffic engineer to make sure that the cones were positioned in a location that I knew that they needed to be placed. And so, you know, as long as the people were arriving to the site separately, you could maintain social distancing and still be able to put these installations in both quickly, low cost, and with a very small team. But I do think it's something that we need to be thinking about to ensure that we're doing these installations in a way that is safe for everybody, not just those that are going to use them. Another question, go ahead, Jennifer.
A question we got right before the webinar, actually, through the Q&A site. What do you do if someone else, a different jurisdiction, closes a park and it puts pressure on the park that's under your jurisdiction? Anybody want to hazard an answer to that difficult question?
So I'll take a swing. I mean, agencies definitely need to be talking to one another, and that there needs to be as much collaboration and sort of a combined effort as we can get. But we need to recognize that, you know, if a federal park is closed, that will put additional burden on the adjacent local parks. And that sort of points even more to this idea that we will need a active transportation route to serve as the relief valve for the parks, so that people can still maintain social distancing in those park spaces and not sort of that's their only option, is to go to the local park.
Yeah, I think it just means also that it puts even more pressure on the local agency to be more creative in tackling this issue. Gwen, do you have anything else you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, my only addition is just to, you know, I think that this comes up in response to several questions and kind of just the general topic, but that there are people that do need to be traveling, people that are essential workers that are getting to and from their jobs that they are still required to show up to. And so I think that it's not just recreation, which this presentation has focused a bit on, but it's also for the critical transportation needs. So providing options and alternatives that provide both recreation and transportation routes is going to be critical.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, very good point. Okay, go ahead. Go ahead, Jeremy.
Another question that we had was about enforcement for communities that have limited policing power for traffic enforcement, and even less so during the coronavirus pandemic. That's one of the main questions: how to close a street to car traffic without having continued police presence. And I think that's definitely an important consideration, and that sort of speaks to this idea of needing a feedback loop and needing an understanding of both how things are performing, and that the messaging needs to be that if these facilities are not used in the way that was intended, it's going to sort of tie the hands of that jurisdiction, and they may have to close it. So that's why I think we need very clear messaging about the intended use, and make sure that we have some feedback loop, so that we're not relying on police services or other emergency services to have to contend with this. And yeah, I think we as neighbors can also be helpful in self-reinforcing this. And I know we've seen this in some of the European countries, that there's almost a little bit of shaming when people are not behaving in a way that is benefiting the public. And I'm certainly not encouraging bullying or shaming, but being a conscious neighbor and mentioning to your neighbor that maybe they're not behaving in the right way, as long as it's done in a friendly and helpful way, I think could go a long way, and help to build a rapport in these really challenging times.
Yeah, we have another question that came in over the webinar Q&A. What's some specific advice for smaller cities that don't have the resources of larger cities, can't just turn on pedestrian recall with a flip of a switch, don't have physical materials to create pop-up lanes, and perhaps don't have the same immediate pressure that places like New York City and Chicago had to keep people-oriented places because of lesser density, but still have narrow sidewalks and overbuilt streets. Jim, you want to take a first shot at it?
Well, and I think this is where having a solid understanding of local context really comes into play, that each agency and each jurisdiction has the best handle on where their needs are, and that they can focus whatever resources are available to the locations that will have the greatest impact, and that, you know, these treatments cannot be universally applied without consideration for the adjacent land uses and sort of the natural operations that we need to ensure that we're accommodating. And if we're not able to make physical changes, there's still opportunities to provide the messaging that we talked about, even if that's just some signs stapled to utility poles, or sort of whatever can be done quickly and inexpensively to reinforce what the expected behavior is. And as I mentioned before, if there are any existing on-call contracts or existing mechanisms that these places can use and really leverage them in this time.
My mind also, yeah, my mind jumps to kind of, you know, the neighborhood, the my kids live here or drive like your kids live here type of signage that I think is present in a lot of neighborhoods already. Those could be, you know, the communities could work with agencies to try to do some messaging about what those mean during these times. Those could be used, you know, in place of barricades or in addition to, you know, a barricade or cones that, so that you could help kind of spread out the materials that you do have. I think also just some of the materials that the resources that were mentioned, there are lots of ideas for how to do it yourself types of things under the, you know, tactile urbanism guides and things like that. So that could be another resource for agencies and communities to look to together. I know that in a project I've worked on, we had some OSB board and just made little do-it-yourself planters with that. And it was a pretty easy thing to do and could be a fun way to get, you know, people could do it at their own homes and then bring them out to a larger group. I think that there's definitely an opportunity to get creative here.
Great. All right, I think we have time for one last question. Let's see. A person in Boston says, we have had several major street redesigns in the planning pipeline, but public meeting and engagement on those plans have been frozen. Any thoughts on advancing planned projects as pilots to try them out now when traffic is absent?
So I would say, as long as those were projects that could have been constructed without moving the curb lines and sort of the physical infrastructure that's sometimes part of projects, as long as that's not a problem, then, and as long as there are the construction crews that can build it and maintain the appropriate safety precautions, as long as the public engagement has occurred, I would say that that's an opportunity, and that's sort of the case with any project that had been identified and already has gone through the public engagement process. I know some jurisdictions are still continuing to do mill and overlay operations, and that it's actually a little easier for them to do traffic control now that there's much less traffic. And so as those are similar projects where if they were already proposing changes to the lane configuration, that can still continue to occur. But it's sort of this idea that you have to think about the projects that have the support already to advance them to a more permanent design.
Yeah, and I think we should also mention that you know, a lot of communities are rethinking their public engagement process and getting very creative about ways to do that. For a project in New Orleans that we've been working on, they just held an entirely online community meeting last week for a rapid implementation project and had more turnout than usual for meetings like that. It's it was easier to access because people didn't have to go out and find childcare and all that kind of stuff. They could do it from their homes. So again, you have to really think about how you're reaching lower income community partners through that process, but it's not necessary that all community engagement has to be frozen at this time. We can find other ways to do it. All right, we are at the end of our hour. I want to thank everybody for participating. We will follow up with an email and some links for additional resources. I want to thank my co-presenters, Jeremy and Gwen, and all of the folks at Tool Design that helped put this webinar together. And with that, be well, be safe, take care of yourselves, and keep in touch about what you're doing in your own communities to rebalance streets for people. Thank you.